Hello everyone, I am Atharva Sharma. I'm a front-end consultant, like you said, and I've been using VueFormulate a lot recently. One of my clients' project needed a lot of forms, so I decided to go with this library. And what I actually did there was I used the schema-based generation of forms to scale forms in a very convenient way. And today we'll be talking about that. So it's actually my second time here again, and it's really nice to speak at Vue.js Berlin. The community is really nice, and they always support you and ask a lot of questions. So let's start with what Vue Formulate is about. I'm sure Justin has already told you a lot about it, and I'll just go. I'll just speak more on that. So Vue Formulate lets you generate forms, and it includes predefined inputs, unstyled, so you can slap on any style framework that you want, Beautify, material frameworks like Bootstrap or even Tailwind. And what you can do is you can create forms using the basic input-based generation, or you can also use schema-based generation, which we are going to talk about today. So schemas are just JSON objects that Vue Formulate takes in and iteratively generates the form based on that. And I'll show you an example of it. Um, okay, so let's look at a particular object. Let's say auth login, and this object has the array which contains objects like component h1. Then you have the email input, password input, the formulate errors, and submit button. And we'll talk more about how this actually all works out and how the forms are generated. So schema-based generation and how I used it for my own use case. So why use schemas? Why not just declare forms how you usually would? Starting with a form tag, then adding inputs into it, and then adding a submit button, maybe binding the data to a model and sending it off as a payload towards API. And why not do that? So one of the reasons for not going over that approach is you end up with a lot of form views. Like you will have auth view, auth login.view, auth signup.view, and it really creates a lot of clutter for something like forms. And when you're dealing with like hundreds of forms, it becomes a pain to manage all of that and make sure that all of your updates are applied everywhere, and any changes that you make to any of the inputs that are made everywhere. So first of all, it helps with a separation of concerns. Then it also helps us make clean components. So if you're using schema-based declaration, you can just provide a schema and a JSON object to the a formulate form component, and it will just generate the schema based on that. You don't really have to worry about copy pasting each of the components. And of course, it leads to developer happiness. Who this implementation is for? So like I said, projects that have a lot of similar forms. And let's take a look at the code and see how it goes. So we have the basic Vue CLI generated project. Um, I have installed everything. So we have Vue Formulate, which I'll be storing in a separate forms directory. So this index.js houses the declaration and imports for Vue Formulate. We have an options object which specifies the error handler that is imported from help. We'll talk about that later on during the talk. Then we have classes, the outer class, input classes, different styling for the different inputs, and we have the label tag helper. Then we have slot components if we are declaring any, and the slot props. To give you a bit of an introduction about what this actually is, options allow us to modify the form the way we want to. Take this as a base config sort of thing for a formulate setup. So when we say about classes, the outer class usually refers to the outer style of the form input. So let's say if I were to inspect this and check what the components of an input is all about. So we'll see that we have input wrapper, we have the input element, then we have the input itself. and there's a label. Then we also have input errors, and all of these styling, these are bare bones HTML components. So HTML inputs. So whatever style we want to, we can apply to them over here. I'll be using Tailwind for this particular project. So a lot of the utilities would be familiar to those who use Tailwind at a regular basis. And yeah, so this is just styling that I have done for this particular project. I have declared a common style string that I'll append to in case of uh, buttons, text area, and inputs. So text area needs styling again, apart from the inputs, because text area needs different height. So we'll customize the height for it. We'll customize the padding too. And then we have the base input styles that we are taking from here. So that will identify all of the text related inputs, border gray, and uh, then we have the button related inputs. So button input is styled different over here. So that's why we have designed this separately. Now let's talk about label. So the label would basically this particular part of the portion of the input. And so if you're not using your own labels, Vue Formulate provides you to pass it on and modify the label however you want to. So if you want to change the position of this label to bottom of the input, that can be also done. And then we have some slot components. Just like Justin talked this previously, we can declare slot components. I'll show you a difference in the docs. Okay, so we have this structure, and like I told you about different slots are provided to us by default. So we have the formulate label, we have the formulate help, we have formulate input type, uh, and we can change the position of any of these. So label can come below, the help slot can come below as well. And then we have formulate errors at the bottom. Now, these slots are okay. They are given to us by default. If we want to, we can modify these and use our own custom slots. So to do that, we can take a look at base input label, and base input label is a label slot that will show a required label if we are passing the prop show required label to true. And we can also provide any icons that we want, so that can also be shown here and passed in the props as well. So to show an example of where we're using this, yes, so this required tag that you see here, that has been generated by the slot component. And the slot component can be used to do a lot of different things as well. So if you wanted to maybe display a tooltip, you can use this and like just uh, say that you have a SVG and provide that, and just use V2 clip or something like that to show the tooltip. Now, that we have an slot component and we have declared it and imported into a form options. So we can override the label slot with our custom slot component, and then provide custom props as well. So whenever we are providing these props like label icon and show required label, this will be available globally to all of our inputs. So if at any of the input, we can just use these labels to modify these props to modify the labels. Now, since we are done with the config, let's see how schemas look like and how we are going to import them into our components, into our views to use them, and how how the form will be generated iteratively. So, okay, this schema.js file contains some form helpers, and form helpers are little helper functions that help us create a lot of forms. So when we are dealing with a lot of forms like that may have a lot of repeatable components, and very it's not very interesting to talk about a lot of just copy paste a lot of same things again and again and again. So helpers let us avoid that. And if we were to say like let's try an icon label, VueFormulate doesn't allow providing icons directly to the labels in inputs like buttons or other labels. So we have been using a default slot to pass to that. And if I were to create a JSON object to generate that, I would have to write, let's say, an icon component, and then maybe the classes to style all of that. And then we have the children like span and the text that goes inside of it. So this generator we can import anywhere, and it will turn out the components that are needed, and we can just spread them out and use them as we want. Next thing that we have would be, okay, so schemas are over here, and in this particular example, we'll be discussing about the auth view and how what kinds of auth views we are dealing with is basically the login. Then we have reset password request. Let me show that to you in the front here. So we have the login view. Then we have reset password
Hey,
where we can provide.
Atharva, I have one comment that people don't see your code; they only see the Chrome.
Oh, that's strange. Let me check that out. Um, oops. I guess I'm not visible on Zoom meeting. Um, oh, this makes sense. Sorry about that. I actually just shared my particular window instead of sharing the whole screen, so that maybe messed the things up. Never mind. I'll start
Yeah. Now,
again.
now it's working. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So okay, so I was talking about the code. Basically, we have the setup with Vue CLI, and I have already installed Vue Formulate Tailwind CSS that what we're using for this particular project. And how I am architecting this whole thing is we have this forms directory. The forms directory houses three JS files: the index.js, that is obviously the formulate declaration, importing the library and providing different options that we can use. Then we have form schemas.js, that is for schemas. So these are JSON objects that we can use and to generate forms iteratively. So if we were to look at the formulate form component, it takes in a schema, a JSON object, and then it returns to us the form. The form sort of looks like this or this, and we have a lot of forms. So this, and then we have the reset password as well. So we'll be dealing with reset password, success, forgot password, and the login form. Now I have already done the declarations and for all these schemas. You can check that it's each input is an object that defines what the uh, component is about. So it's let's say it's a h1 tag, and we can pass in the data as the children property, because an h1 tag houses what is to be displayed inside of it as the children slot. So we can pass in login, and then we can pass in any styles that we may want to apply to this specifically. So let's say classes like text 3XL, text center, font bold, that we can apply over here as well. Then we have the email input. So let's say we have the autocomplete set to new email, so it won't uh, ask for autocomplete in the input. And then we have validation, which is bail, and this bail modifier is really important. It What it does is that when multiple validation rules are passed, instead when the rules fail, instead of failing all at once, they'll fail one by one. So let me show you an example of that. If I were to say provide a non-email string, it will say it is not a valid email address. Okay, and the other rule is email. So first is required. other is email. So the first error is shown is required. Then when we type the wrong email address, it will say not a valid email address. Now, if we did not have the bail modifier and we just use the required and email validations right away, what would happen actually is they both will be shown together. So email is required and please enter a valid email address. And that is not an ideal user experience in my opinion. So that's why I use the bail modifier. Then we have the password validation. All of the validations in my particular project are triggered on blur event. You can change the behavior to live or something else. But I like the blur behavior, so that's why we are going with that. Whenever we click on the submit button, it will validate all the inputs and show us what all inputs are failing. So we can correct the inputs and go on with that. Now, that is about validations and declaring rules. Now there are other types of rules as well. If certain validation does not suit you, you can always create your own validation rule that we have done over here. So first about the error syntax, VueFormulate allows two types of ways to declare validation rules. So first way was using a simple string, then you separate them, and that works as well. But now when you are providing something like a regex, so using an array-based syntax makes more sense. You can just provide the name of the validation, then you can provide the parameters that would be needed. So if it would be, let's say min 6 length, sorry, min comma 6 one length, then you can provide that in an array syntax by just separating them as different uh, lengths. Then you have the custom validation declaration. So matches identifies whatever custom validation that we are going to provide. So if I were to say, let's make the password a strong password and it should contain at least one lowercase, one uppercase, one number, and one special character. So we can do that as well. And we can say provide also a custom validation message for it. So password should contain at least one lowercase, one uppercase, one number, and one special character. Now, let's say if we were to compare the passwords, in that case we will use the confirm password validation. So confirm password validation will make sure that the passwords are matching. It will also ask us which password to compare to. So we can provide keys like uh, name with password and password confirm. So that will automatically hints we formulate which password to uh, compare to, and then we can provide the bail parameter as well to see what all the validation errors are and loop through them one by one. And this parameter confirm password tells us like hints us which input we are aiming at. Um, then we have the formulate errors component that shows the errors in the form. So if you are submitting the form and the API returns us an error object, maybe a 400 status code or a 500 status code, we can control cache those error and the formulate errors component will display them. So I'll also talk about how that works in a second. Then we have the submit component that will trigger the form submission. We can provide different styles to it, and then we talked about the icon label function that is taking two parameters, uh, a string that probably hints to a font or some icon, and then we have the label. What this function does is it's a form helper function, and it takes in two parameters, icon and the label, and then it will append the string, the icon string to the base classes, whatever you want to, and also the span, and it will return out a JSON object that will create that particular label. Now, if I were to if I were to um, yeah, so if we are to check how the form is being generated and see one of the forms in live action. Let's do that. Let's try the login. We'll see how the form gets generated, where the schema is being imported, and how it is working. So the schemas are stored in form schemas.js. We have a function called getForm schema that returns a form schema by taking the schema name as input. So we are not importing all the schemas at once. We are just returning the requested schema, and the schema name is passed on via the auth.view view. So this computer property returns the form schema, and it takes in this dot form name. Form name is a route meta property which contains the schema key. So if we go over to a router file, and I modularize the routes to separate different kinds of routes that there can be. So if you are working on a large project, which ideally you are, if you're watching this talk, uh, then you might have setting routes, auth routes, dashboard routes, different sort of modules, and where you have a similar kind of routes all grouped together. So this schema key specifies the login schema that will be imported over into our application. Then we have reset password request link schema, and similarly, all these routes contain their own schema keys that will be imported into our application and used. So when a particular route is visited, okay. So when a particular route is visited, we get all the components imported. So this is the login h1, and these objects are then provided to the formulate form, and then the components are generated. The inputs, the good thing about VueFormulate is that all of the inputs are unit tested pretty well. So we don't really have to worry about these inputs breaking and failing. That part has been taken care of already. So it also takes that headache away from us. Now, if I were to show you an example of how the API handler would work, so ideally, when we submit a function a form, we are taking the form name, that is the schema key, and then we are taking the form's data that it is providing to us via the submit event. So we have the data object over here. Now, whenever we are calling the form name, we did a method. So the methods are named as schema key. You can also maybe use a switch case statement or a other method to return which submit function to use. But for this, the ease of use in this particular tutorial, I'm using the method names are same as the schema keys. So if we have auth login, we would write this dollar formulate handle, and we are providing it a fake error object that would say a detail, credentials don't match, and status code 400. And we are then also providing this dot formula name. So that is the parameter, which is the schema. Now, if I go over to form helpers and check my API header handler, it shows me different, takes the error object as the parameter, and then it creates a new error data, which displays the input errors object and the form errors array. Now the input errors object is the object that encapsulates all the errors related to the particular form. So this is ideally what is being shown in your formulate errors component. And then we have the form errors array. That is what ideally would be shown for each of the inputs. So sorry, input errors will be shown for the inputs and form errors will be shown for the particular form. Sorry about that. Now, status, if there's an response status, we'll show the status, and let's say something went wrong. Then we have the detail. If there's a detail inside the error object, we'll check for that and assign it to detail variable. And we have message. So if there's an error message, we'll assign to that. And then finally, we push an error onto the form errors array, stating like, oops, detail, if detail false, then message. If message is not there, then we can just provide the generic error. Generic error is the status, and then something went wrong. So this handles all of our error cases. and make sure that the errors that are coming from the API are being handled well. So for the sake of this tutorial, we are doing a fake error, uh, credentials don't match, and see if that. So I'll provide example email address and enter some random password and see, oops, credentials don't match, please try again. So that is the error we would expect. And now what if yeah, so how would a successful form submission look like? The form proceeds and it's sent off. So if you were to maybe do some manipulations over to the success part of the form, maybe you want to display a snack bar or a modal, you can do so as well. Instead of checking for the error handling, you can maybe attach, maybe return a promise and check on the promise. If the promise succeeds, you can attach a success event to it, and if the promise fails, you can catch that error and display it over here. Now let's talk about some gotchas in Vue Formulate and what are some things that we need to be careful about. So one of the problems with schema-based declaration is that whatever we don't have the view kind of reactivity in these schemas. So whenever we are dealing with something like UI 18n, it's better to either use the schema inside our current view. So we would put the schema directly into our data property and do any kind of transitions over there. Or if we want to do it in a schemas.js file, so we'll have to set up the activity manually. So instead of having a particular label, we'll likely do a getter. So if I were to say, instead of using your email, let's say get label, and that would return a string or a bound binding, maybe whatever you want to. So you have to use a getter for that particular use case, something dynamic, because we don't have reactivity in this particular schemas. Mm, Apart from this, I guess pretty much we have pretty much covered the schemas this case. Um, yeah, so if we were to declare different slot components, like I said, we would provide a slot prop to it. So if I were to show a required label, I would just say show required label set to true, and that would show a required label on my considered input. So what it does is it swaps out the default label of VueFormulate and replaces it with our custom label. That is what we built. So here we can see the required label is appended. Um, we can also define strings that we may want to use in our forms repeatedly. So this was before the tailwind announced that they will be supporting uh, pseudo variants in classes. So if you were to use something like LG and then provide static, so it's better to just put it all into a common string and then use the same string imported into a schemas everywhere that you want to. So that's how I use link styles. I import the base link styles and then add any customization that I have to text back, and then it would change everything and do the conversions for me. What if I wanted to append something to current styles? That is also pretty easy. We have the base button styles. Now, if we want to assign a new background color to it, we can do so easily by providing into an array. So anything inside an array syntax would be something that is appended to the current class string instead of replacing it completely. So if I were to say just button styles, it would replace the whole class string instead of appending to it. Now we also have, yeah, so that is pretty much it. There can be other helpers as well. So if you are using a date picker and you want to stop the dates to all the dates except today, you can use that by providing a date string function and returning the today's date. Um, I guess that is pretty much it. Now, what are the next steps? So next steps obviously would be if we want to, if our application has forms in basically all of our components, it may be wise to use something as a mixin instead of importing the schemas into every component and then using them. So I would say maybe let's get rid of everything here. So let's say, yeah. So we have removed the get form schema import, and then we have removed the component properties and also the submit function because these are pretty generic and these deal with the form name key which we are getting from the route. So it would be better to that just handle it globally. So whenever we make a change, it gets applied to all of our views. Now, if I go over to my main.js and I'll comment this code. Yeah, so we are importing the get form schema from our form schemas, and we have the view mixin where we are adding a build property form name and then returning this dot meta dot schema, which we have seen includes a meta property that lists the name of a schema. Then we have the form schema, which imports the form schema from the get form schema method and it returns it out. Now we have the submit function that takes the form name and the data and then submits the form. So we can use this instead of all of that. This will make our component even smaller. And we just have to deal with pod.view main.js. And all of our concerns regarding the forms are already being separated into the forms directory. If we try this out, yes, our forms still look the same, they work the same, and everything is good. Now, before we finish the talk, my particular reason for using Vue Formulate was I had to deal with a lot of forms and it was cumbersome to manage them into each and every view. What I initially aimed at doing was to keeping the forms at a single place. So if I were to apply a single sort of style that is different for a particular set of module. So if auth forms have the button colors blue, I can easily specify a string and just provide all of that right there. And that would also mean that if there are similar shared components, I can also modify them and provide them as a function and import them into a module and use them. That is what my use case was. And it also provides me a good separation of concerns. So that is a big plus. Apart from this, if you have any other questions, I would love to answer them now. And I'll also be joining the podcast after this. So if there are any questions, you can ask me there as well.